Welcome to Horror Makes Us Happy, the podcast where we ask the question, what is it about horror that makes us happy? Your hosts are Steve Becker and myself, Chris Whitman, and you can find out more about us at our website, horrormakesushappy.com. Before we get started, this is the trigger warning. This is a horror podcast, so we're going to be talking about horror things, which could involve sensitive subjects such as child abuse, violence, the R word, the F word. There will be bad things, potentially, but not definitely, in this conversation. So with that out of the way, Steve, what do we got coming up in the near future?
Oh, still lots of stuff. We've still got more than 10 people on the calendar, so we're not going to bother listing all of that. As far as self-promotion stuff, Chris's webcomic, piecesofflesh.com, my book, A Guide to the Recovery Toolbox, currently has a coupon LE69E on smashwords.com. But today's guest...
Today, we have with us one Mr. Tom Holland, writer known for several works, most notably Fright Night, Child's Play, and Psycho 2. Welcome to the show, sir.
And also, no, actually, yes, Cloak and Dagger and what was the other one? Thinner. No, well, technically it wasn't right around Thinner. Well, I guess, was it screenplay? Maybe it was. Anyway, there's also actor and director and stuff like that too. So there's got a lot going on. But welcome. Thank you for joining us, Tom.
Well, my pleasure to be here.
Before we get into the meat of the interview, do you want to let us know what you're currently working on?
Yes, I have a book called Oh Mother, What Have You Done? That is going up on Amazon, and you can also get it at my website called terrortime.shop if you want it autographed or personalized. Okay. And it is the story of the creation of Psycho 2. And this came about because this summer, which I guess we're still in, feels like it here in LA anyway. It's hot enough that it was the 40th anniversary this summer, and there was an explosion of existing interest in Psycho 2, which sort of blew me away. And then to really fill the story in, a very nice guy named Mark Hartley arrived at my house and gave me the 4K from Australia of Cloak and Dagger.
Nice.
Including with little figure, with the Jack Flack figure that went with it.
Awesome.
And he told me that Richard Franklin had done his memoirs before he passed. And he passed in 2007 of cancer. And I was like blown away because I'd been in contact and seen him and his wife, as they passed through LA for years, but then he'd gotten sick and he was down in Australia and, it turned into more of an email kind of thing. But I didn't know he had written his memoirs, which are basically his love of film. And then all the films that he did, and the biggest chunk was on Psycho 2. And Psycho 2 is the film that exploded my career. And Richard's widow, a lovely, lovely woman called Jennifer Haddon, sent me the memoir, and I read it, and it was like stepping back 40 years for me, because Richard described, the whole genesis of Psycho 2, but also hiring me and how he worked with me or how we worked together on developing the script and the whole thing. And then I thought to myself, well, I've got it. There were so few of us left. Basically, the people that are left are Psycho 2 as myself and Andrew London, who was the editor. And I got hold of Andrew and I said, I want to put this down so people will know what the experience was like, because it was such a one-off. So you read it and it's like being in a symposium, or a conversation between the three of us. And I think, and of course, I include photos and lobby cards and budgets and storyboards and all that, but it's really the conversation. And it was really like going back and reliving 40 years ago for me. And it was an amazing experience. And I'm so happy I'm getting it out there now. Because it hadn't occurred to me before the congruence of both the 40th and the arrival of Richard's memoirs. And I think it goes way beyond the making of book,
Right.
really is about the genesis of the whole idea, because that was a moment in time when they didn't do sequels, and and certainly no one had the temerity to think about doing a sequel to Psycho, because Hitchcock's Psycho at that moment in time was, and Hitchcock too, Mr. Hitchcock, were considered, they were iconic.
Well, yeah, it's a big legacy to carry, especially making a sequel out of one of Hitchcock's films. Well,
especially out of Psycho. Psycho was the first slasher film.
Yeah.
I mean, Psycho changed our conception.
Psycho was the Jaws before Jaws was Jaws.
Of horror. Before that, it had been AIP and Hammer films,
Mm-hmm.
And so it was extraordinary. The whole experience of writing it and reliving it, and I put a lot of work into it, and I hope that people really enjoy, and it's going to be out to purchase, and in a week or two. We just got approved today, as a matter of fact. I just got from Amazon. So boy.
I'm sure people will love to get into that, and it also sounds like you will probably even more appreciate the concept of what we're doing here in our podcast more than I expected you to.
Well, Chris Sarandon said you guys really, really did a deep dive.
Yes, we
he had a lot of respect for your knowledge and the quality of your questions.
Nice, we appreciate that. Yeah. So we briefly talked a little bit before we hit record, and so you kind of know what the first question is going to be, but I'll throw it out there anyway. What are some of your earliest memories of scary things?
Well, my earliest memories were I just fell in love with it as a kid. I figure around 9 or 10, and I'm back in. People are going to think this is like ancient history, but I'm back in the late 50s, and there really wasn't. There really weren't horror movies, as hard as that is to believe.
Right.
The EC Comics is my first memory, the Tales of the Crypt comics and those things. And then they were banned, I think, in 1954, 5, or 6. And all of a sudden, you couldn't read them, you couldn't get them. And what started to happen was, I was in high school, junior high, I guess, and a few other kids in school, they were all male. The few other guys in school, and there weren't many, like 3 or 4, who were interested in what even then wasn't even thought of as a genre, but in the EC Comics, which were, short, pithy tales with a twist at the end.
Yep, always got to have that monkey's paw twist.
That's the kind of cat got your tongue, and then you'd find out literally the cat got your tongue.
Yeah.
Right. But we would, when they were banned, we would take them and we would hide them and pass them around to each other in high school.
Nice.
There was no horror fans in those days. I mean, it was such a beginning. The biggest horror movie I can think of from my earliest memory was Them. If you remember that.
I recognize the title, but I don't think I've ever seen it.
That's the one about the giant ants.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, because it started out with films that were Godzilla-type films that were about the reaction to nuclear warfare.
Oh, yeah. I guess that was a common theme that kind of ushered cinema and storytelling into the horror era, was radioactive monsters, like you said, because you had that inspiration from real life of the fear of new nuclear possibilities.
You were in a period when in high school you would have drills and how to get underneath your desk and cover your head because an atomic bomb was going to be dropped.
Yeah.
So the paranoia about a wholesale death and atomic warfare was just huge. And here we are headed back again for that, probably, as the world becomes increasingly unstable.
Maybe.
Anyway, I started looking around, and they were mainly sci-fi movies, terrible ones in those days, and EC Comics. And then I got into Hammer films. And off of Hammer, AIP, which was the American ripoff of Hammer, which is all the Vincent Price films and the Christopher Lee films from Hammer. And I guess by the late 50s or by 1960, I was a die-hard horror sci-fi fan.
Okay.
So that would be when, toward the end of high school, I graduated in 1961.
Did you have a particular story from Tales of the Crypt that you remember? It stood out to you?
No, but I directed 3 of them. And
I remember seeing that.
I wrote them too. One of the ones I'm most proud of is they called it 3-Sided Triangle. I did Lover Come Hack to Me, which is the 3rd one ever done. And then I did 3-Sided Triangle, and I did a pilot for Two-Fisted Tales that I shared with Dick Donner. And it's about drag racing, and it stars a then unknown actor that I cast named Brad Pitt.
Never heard of him.
Never heard of him. I know how you feel, but you can. I think you can find him on. I know you can find him online.
Right.
I think that they may be on YouTube. I don't know.
He's in some older films where it's a real surprise to see him in them. Like what was it, True Romance?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Was there any particular Hammer film that stood out to you?
All the Dracula Christopher Lee ones, and I can't,
of course,
the titles blur in my mind, but there are 2 or 3 that are better than the other ones, but I can't remember the titles right now.
Without going into the title, do you remember what you liked about them?
Well, was the color for one thing. It was very saturated. You know, I mean, it was very vivid. What they put their money were in the sets, which is to say, the Hammer got hold of some great old Victorian house. I think it was in the suburbs of London, and they shot most everything there at that period. Mm. And then after Psycho, they got Jimmy Sangster in to write, and they did a lot of films that were more psychological and more influenced by the huge success of Hitchcock's Psycho. So they had like 2 different periods. But I got into them initially with Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee. But that's where Peter Vincent comes from in Fright Night. That's my combining Peter Cushing and Vincent Price.
Ah.
Okay, that makes sense now you put it that way. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Did you participate in Halloween when you were a kid?
Did I guess? But Halloween wasn't what we now think of as Halloween.
Right.
Yeah. Halloween really was little kids walking around in the neighborhood, and I think we even did it without the parents, maybe, because in those days you were paranoid. You didn't have the danger level that you do now.
Right.
And and getting some candy.
Yeah.
When I was a kid, the biggest holiday was Christmas, which was just wonderful.
Right.
But now I look around and my gosh, the money they're spending on Halloween, it tells you something about our society, but it must be equaling Christmas at this point.
For some people, it's more.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Did you
that's
have
a sad commentary, actually.
Well, I don't know about that. Did you have a favorite costume when you were a kid?
Cosplay wasn't a thing then.
Well, particular for Halloween?
I mean, for Halloween, yeah.
Oh, for Halloween.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I do things like pirates or this is back when Westerns were just huge. Mm-hmm. It was Davy Crockett, which was like the biggest television series on for kids from Disney.
Yeah.
Davy Crockett.
something, the Wild Frontier.
There you go.
Fess
Parker, I guess. Yes, yes. But everybody was wearing a coonskin cap if they were under 10 years old.
Yeah, that's a costume that you don't even have to wait for Halloween for that. Like, it's just the thing. Look at A Christmas Story. What was it, Scott Farkas?
Yes, that's right. That's right.
When you were a kid, did you have any really scary dreams that you remember? Or reoccurring nightmares?
No, but I was an odd kid. My 2 loves in life have been movies and reading.
Okay.
And kids didn't read, but I did. And I had a paper route, and this was in Austining, New York. And when I'd finish the paper route, I'd walk home, and I would stop at the library, the Austining Public Library, and read. And what happened to me, this is probably boring, but what happened to me was I'm left-handed. But when I first started in school, if you were left-handed, they taught you how to write with your right hand.
Yep,
that's right.
And then when I got a little bit older, like the 2nd grade or something, they went back and they switched me from my right hand to my left hand.
Well, that's not confusing at all.
It was very confusing. And I ended up being able to write backwards fluently. And I felt like I couldn't, it was like having dyslexia. I couldn't read because of my perception. And they sent me to remedial reading, they called it in those days. And they would put me in front of a book, and they'd put a pointer on the book that followed the lines, the sentences. And I had to keep pace with the pointer. And what happened was I started to be able to read, and I turned into a speed reader.
Okay.
I'm able to read very, very quickly and comprehend. And it also turned me into a champion essay test taker. My math is stunningly mediocre, but my reading ability and my ability to handle essay tests, which is what the latter part of high school and certainly college were all about.
Yep.
I ended up being very, very strong academically from somebody who, when he was in like the fourth grade, couldn't read at all.
Do you remember having a favorite book from when you were going to the library back then?
Yeah, anything having to do with William Payson Terhune, who wrote all the horse stories, the Black Stallion, all those stories. And also all the Lassie and dogs, all those great dog stories. Okay. And from there, I got into Black Beauty, and I got into all the pirate books, Treasure Island, all the great books. I mean, anything that they did a classic comic on.
Are you talking about the Gold Key comics?
Is that what they were?
I can't think of what the other ones were, but I know Gold Key did a lot of them.
Okay, well then whoever did the classic comics off the classic books, I read all of them.
Okay.
And then I did go to the books.
Okay.
And I was doing it at a very young age before anybody else. I even tackled Nietzsche at like 12 or 13, 14.
Wow.
Not that I comprehended, but I was able to read it.
Yeah.
Right. Let's see. Did you have anything happen in real life that terrified you as a kid?
Well, I suppose the bullies, all of that. But I mean, what I learned was that, I don't know whether my father taught me or not, but what I learned was when somebody was pushing me around, if I hit him as hard as I could in the nose, and then after that he beat the crap out of me, but he'd never bother me again.
Yep.
So I learned at some point I was tortured by them like in the 4th and 5th grade. But somewhere before I got into what was called junior high then, which I think was 7th, 8th, 9th grade, I'd learned to fight back, but not like to fight back where I would I would always lose is what I'm saying. But if I fought back, they'd leave me alone after that. Right. And that worked very well.
Yeah, sort of prison yard rules, You at least show that you have some fight.
Right. Mm-hmm. Flipping that question around, was there ever a moment in your childhood when you felt completely calm or safe or bliss?
Yeah, whenever I was leading another life by reading a book, or absolutely transfixed by a movie. But the movies that I was transfixed by were actually all the ones that were considered really terrible. I mean, any monster movie had me there right away. And then I got into Florrie Ackerman at some point, that was the first monster magazine that I remember.
Was there anybody in your family who was a fan of horror?
No. I had no. I'm an only child, and my parents had a mom and pop dress store, first a haberdashery, and then they went into women's clothes because the markup was higher.
Right.
So I was alone 6 days a week. I'm the one that grew up doing the house cleaning. And then when I got old enough to be able to deal with people, I started clerking in my parents' store. Okay, so, it was a 6-day work week all my life for my parents. God bless them.
Some of our guests have reported that there was sort of a dividing line where prior to this line, they were afraid of horror. And then after the dividing line, they were now fans of horror and enjoyed it. Was there ever a dividing line like that for you where you were afraid it previously, or was it always enjoyable to you? I
was always, there was so little of it, that that I had a ravenous hunger for it, but there was no way to satisfy it. You know, and it sort of grew as I grew. The real shift was Hitchcock's movie Psycho. And that was, 1960 or 61, which I watched absolutely terrified. And I don't think that that was a really seminal experience for me. I don't think before that I realized that there was such a thing as film editing. If you remember the old AIP Hammer films, they were very, very, very traditional in terms of their editing. With Hammer, you start with a wide shot to give you the set, and maybe they would do over the shoulders, but I mean they did very few close-ups, and they almost never did an insert. And all of a sudden, you have the shower scene. And not only that, he killed his female star about 40 minutes in.
Right.
And that was absolutely never done. And he used a butcher knife. I mean, my God, fellas, I mean, there had been nothing like that. There had been nothing at that level of visceral terror until Hitchcock.
Right.
And I wanted to go to film school, and there were no film schools, fellas.
No, not at that time.
So I had a choice of, my memory is I had a choice of Northwestern Theater School or Carnegie Tech Theater School.
Yeah, I was going to say, I imagine if anything, there would be theater school at least.
Well, that was all there was. Those were the two popular ones anyway. And I applied and got into both, and I went to Northwestern for my freshman year because at least they offered some academics. I was smart enough to realize that I wanted a broader education than just theater. But in order to do that, I had to somehow turn me into an actor because that was the only way I could get into something close to film.
Interesting. Yeah, your goal was ultimately writing, but you had to actually get the foot in the door through acting.
I wanted to make films before people thought of that. My parents thought I was mad and were worried sick about me. They thought, that's no profession. This is the aftermath of World War II. My father fought in World War II. He went over to Africa, North Africa, to gear up for the invasion of Italy. And so I grew up in the backwash of World War II. It was a totally different country than it is now. Nobody could conceive. I'm from a small town in mid-state New York, Highland, New York. It was apple orchards and cattle, and it was unimaginable to be interested in any of the things I was interested in.
I have asked that of a number of our guests in the past that I'm like you. There were certain things that never even occurred to me were even a possibility of being something that somebody could do for a living until I was in my 20s and 30s. And by that time I had already kind of gone in a particular direction. And it's kind of funny looking back on it. There are people who have known that they wanted to do this their entire lives. And I'm like, how did you even know that was an option?
Well, I knew that I wanted to do it, but it wasn't an option.
Right.
And I got very, very lucky. And I had a drama teacher in high school in my sophomore year in high school. And I told him what I was interested in. And he shoved me towards acting because that was all he could conceive of.
Right.
And he got me a job apprenticing at Bucks County Playhouse in Bucks County, Pennsylvania. And what I learned from that was that I learned about acting.
Yeah.
But it was a way in to get to Hollywood and to movies.
Right.
And so
I would say that's probably a good preparation for Hollywood too, because that almost seems to be the status quo with how it works. Your ultimate goal is this, but to get started, you have to do this adjacent thing.
Well, that's certainly what happened to me. From that, I got an agent for commercials, for TV commercials.
Yeah, yep. Another foot in the door.
That's right, and I got work as a commercial actor, and that sort of opened the door to Northwestern. And then I did the freshman year at Northwestern with, if you're interested, and this is 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis, okay?
Yeah.
I'm sure you're much younger, but I mean, it was still the backwash of American paranoia about an atomic war. And that was the closest I remember to the start to an exchange of atomic missiles back then.
Yeah.
And everybody was terrified of that. And then and at the end of my first year, I went back of college at Northwestern. I went back to New York City and looking for work now as an actor as well as making money at television commercials. I got a 7-year contract to Warner Brothers. And I came out to LA, and I was 19 years old, I think. And I was so young I had to go to court to sign the 7-year contract. And I got signed by Jack Warner himself, and I met Jack Warner in the executive suite at Warner Brothers.
Wow!
And of course, I was gaga because it was the studio that had done. Jimmy Dean had been there, Paul Newman. Jimmy Dean had done a Rebel out of there, I think, and Paul Newman had done that god awful first movie playing a Roman, The Silver Chalice, out of there. And the sets were still standing to My Fair Lady on the biggest soundstage that Warner Brothers had. The Ascot Raceway set was still there. And then this was also when the studios were falling apart under the onslaught of television.
Well, hang on. I want to go back to childhood and ask 2 more questions about childhood and then come back to the teenage years. And I'm going to ask these 2 questions sort of back to back. We're going to start with a negative one so we can end on a positive one, okay?
Okay.
The negative one is, do you remember the first person you hurt?
You mean that I had a fight with?
Physically,
or
emotionally,
doesn't matter.
Mentally, whatever.
No, I've always been very sensitive to not doing that.
Okay.
That's a fair answer.
Yeah.
I mean, later on in life I did, but they were more about romances.
Right.
But that when I was young, no, I was very, very sensitive to other people's, to other kids' turmoil, and
Mm-hmm. Do you remember the first person you helped?
Boy, I remember protecting people.
Anyone in particular?
Well, yeah, I didn't understand it, but I did. Yeah, I had a friend who was gay, but I didn't know it, and his name was Claude, and I pulled other kids off of him.
Okay,
good.
But I mean, I'm back like in the 5th, 6th grade.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
But when I got to junior high school, I was getting along back a lot better. Grade school was hellish, actually.
It almost always is.
Because cruelty was the tone of the day. I mean, nothing crueler.
It was like the status quo.
Yeah, 2nd, 3rd, 4th grade, there's nothing crueler than other kids. But
I think that is always the case, even today.
Today?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
I think it has a lot to do with the childhood development patterns of, kids go through different stages, and that part of their lives is very fraught with a lot of different things. But good answer. I mean, we like to ask those 2 questions because you never know what's going to come up. A lot of people have different interesting things that come up to their memory. So moving back to teenage years then. So you had mentioned Psycho was big, and that came out. Do you remember anything else, books or movies that were impactful during your teen years?
Yeah, Breathless was a mind blower.
What was?
Breathless with Jean-Paul Belmondo. I'd never seen jump cuts in film. And this is before film school. But I mean, I for whatever reason, I was just interested in film. And I like film noir as well as horror. Mm-hmm. But Belmont,
they're related.
Yeah, but Breathless was the first time that they didn't jump cut until Breathless that I don't remember. This is a time when if you had a lens flare, it was considered a failure.
An accident, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the film was supposed to be able to, movies were supposed to take you in and never call attention to the technical side.
Right.
So you would stay in the story. But you started to see, foreign films coming in.
I'm really curious. Did you recognize, like maybe you didn't know it was called a jump cut at the time, but did you really recognize that there was different editing or different cuts going on at that time?
Yes, I did. Listen, it was so hard for me. I don't know how I learned this, but it was so hard for me I get into the story and I'd forget about the cutting. But I really realized there was editing with Psycho. And I would take and take a Good and Plenty candy box, and I would try to rip a piece off every time I saw an edit to keep me out of being in the story and aware of the editing.
Okay.
So I was trying to teach myself, and I figured that out on my own. But there was nowhere to learn. And when I finally got to Northwestern that freshman year in '62, I went and found the film department in Northwestern, which was one small room with a couple of graduate students in, and they had a 16 mil camera, and they had short ends, which is where they got free film left over, from this is in Chicago. And I went out and I shot my first film, we didn't have any sound. I took a motorcycle and I ran it off the side of the road, and then I physically tried to get the motorcycle back up to the road from the hill. And I had the help of the graduate student, and we shot the living hell out of it from every angle. And then we got it processed, and we got back there, and they had 2 cold splicers, and you had to wear white gloves, and you put down acetone to put the ends together when you spliced. And I tried to edit the film, and of course I had no story; it was just the event, and it was holy hell trying to edit it. And I took that film and carried that film around with me for several years. And then I got involved with an acting teacher in New York called Milton Katsalis, who went on to be very noted in Hollywood. He's been long gone now. But Milton, that was the first I heard about Scientology too, by the way. Anyway, Milton and I tried to edit it, and I don't even know what happened to the film, but I learned a lot technically, and I took a lot of those questions with me when I was under that 7-year contract to Warner Brothers.
Let's see, for teenage years, like you mentioned earlier on, Halloween wasn't a big thing when you were a kid. Did you participate in Halloween as a teen?
I guess. I don't really remember. I don't remember Halloween being that big a thing back then.
Okay.
Yeah, as you said earlier, it's grown exponentially over the years. And also a lot of our guests don't really... teenage years is kind of when you deviate away from trick-or-treating and dressing up. And if anything, you go to parties with friends or things like that. And then you return to it as an adult if you have kids.
Yeah. Did you have any
described it pretty well. Did you have any
recurring nightmares or dreams as a teen?
No, but I went through the explosion of Elvis Presley. Okay. And I realized what a huge cultural event that was.
Okay.
And I watched him on Ed Sullivan with the rest of America. That was a huge change in music. Before then, you'd had my father's generation, which was big band music.
Right.
But when Elvis came in, that was the beginning of rock and roll. That was Bill Haley and the Comets, Rock Around the Clock. It was the movies were the high school movie with Glenn Ford, I think, and Maggie Hayes. Concrete Jungle.
Sounds right.
I ripped it off with Class of '84 when I wrote that.
All right. Did you have anything actually terrifying happen in real life as a teen?
Not like you're asking, no, because you're asking what gave me a proclivity for writing the kinds of films that I did. That's what you're asking.
No, not necessarily. I mean, literally, did you have something terrify you in real life as a teen?
Not that I remember.
Okay. Not every question is going to land. You just never know until you ask. Let's see. So by your teens, did you start meeting other people who were fans of horror, or were you still kind of on your own?
I met the 3 or 4 other boys in high school who were interested in horror with EC Comics.
Okay.
But I mean, the fellows, you didn't have an explosion into horror until Stephen King. And, when I was an adult by then. But Stephen, people don't really, if you put Stephen's effect within an historical perspective, Stephen exploded film to the middle class, to the bourgeois, whatever you want to call it. He made it safe to read horror because he used so many brand names in what he wrote. So you can imagine happening in your own life. Before that, I had read all the Victorian horror. Well, this would have been when I was in high school, and I must have started, it was probably junior high school, 7th, 8th grade. And you're going to ask me what I read. I read Bram Stoker. I read Dracula. I got hold of Frankenstein by the woman. I read the classics, but there was nothing else in horror. Mm-hmm. And there were 2 or 3 writers, and I can't remember their names now, who did Victorian horror. We're talking about late 1800s, very, very early 1900s. And then there was no modern horror books to read. EC Comics were the closest I could find to it, and that's because of that genius who wrote The Thing with McDonald. Come on,
I want to say yes.
Yeah, he had the magazine. He created science fiction. I read everything that was written in science fiction when I had my paper route, and I'm talking about Heinlein and Asimov and Zalesny, and that was there. Science fiction was exploding, not horror.
Right.
Okay. I'm in the late 50s now.
Yep.
And that was all those books. I think that Heinlein wrote YA novels before they had YA as a category.
Right.
And he come out with a couple a year. And I mean, I devoured all of that.
So moving into adult years, then you mentioned Stephen King. Was there anything else that really jumped out to you in your adult years that you've been a fan of?
Well, when the genre really started, and my memory is AIP and Hammer, I devoured everything, but it didn't really explode until Psycho. And I mean, then Carpenter took it to another level with Halloween, which is really sort of taking what Hitchcock had established with the slasher and really taking it, to a much cruder, much more accessible, much more commercial, level. And that exploded the films. But you're back in what? One was 7. Well, let's see. Carrie was 1972 or 3.
I don't remember off the top of my head.
Yeah.
I want to say it was 73.
I think it was. I mean, my memory is the 60s were oh God, that's all the hippie stuff and all the love stuff and all that.
Yeah.
But I mean, the horror was not, was not. When was Rosemary's Baby? What year?
I thought that was the late 70s, wasn't it?
No, before that, I think.
68. Wow.
Okay, 1968. Mm-hmm. Okay, well, that was a huge step up in terms of psychological horror.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, especially with the twist.
Yeah, I'm sure I could sit down and work on the cultural milestones, but it didn't really explode until the early 70s, and I put that down with Stephen King.
Okay.
That's what's because you're talking like so much of what we're talking about. There were not horror conventions.
Right.
No. I mean, I think fanatic conventions weren't even so much a thing back then. It was convention was seen as more of a networking for businesses kind of thing. Yes.
Yeah. Back then, you mean
60s, 70s.
Yeah. It was. Well, I don't remember them in the 60s, but they sure started in the early 70s. You had people like Frank Dietz, Dietz, writers like David J. Scow, the little guy in the white ice cream suit. He's the one who wrote the short story for the original Terminator that Cameron ripped off and ended up paying.
Didn't know about that.
I remember it, but I didn't remember his name.
He was very abrasive, but he was very talented. Huge short story writer.
What did Frank Dietz do?
Frank Dietz did a lot of art, Disney art, but he was into monsters, and he was an early fan.
Mm-hmm.
Just he has a whole history. You'll find him all over the place. He's still very active. And David Scow is too. He wrote the Masters of Horror episode that I did. We all scream for ice cream. I mean, John Ferris wrote it, but David did the adaptation.
Okay. I want to go back to Stephen King for a minute. You had mentioned him a few times. Was there any particular work that really stood out to you of his?
Every one of them. He had an incredible run. Preternaturally talented. I mean, extraordinarily talented. I mean, he ran from Carrie, which I can't remember, 71, 2 or 3. The book may have been 71, the movie in 73.
Yeah.
I mean, he came out with, Salem's Lot. He came out with 6 or 7 of The Shining. Came out with 6 or 7 in a row, all of which were brilliant.
Yeah, he did just kind of explode right out the gate like that.
Yeah, he exploded it. I mean, horror exploded in the 70s.
Yeah.
Psycho 2 was the second biggest movie in the summer of 1982. The only movie that made more money was the first sequel to Star Wars. Huh. So that tells you how big Psycho 2 was.
I mean, nobody was into Star Wars at that time. It was a small thing. Nobody knew.
Well, Star Wars changed science fiction.
Right.
In movies anyway.
Yeah.
There's a brilliant horror movie that was done called Trilogy of Terror, by the way. It's the reason
yes, that one has come up a few times, the Tiki Doll.
Well, that's why I did Child's Play.
Okay, really?
Because that movie had blown me away. Because the Prey, the Tiki Doll, that episode I thought was so brilliant, and that's Richard Matheson. And Richard Matheson, I met him when I did Amazing Stories, and he was like a god to me as a writer. But I mean, what we're talking about is, we're doing a cultural history, and trying to remember it.
Yeah.
And I lived it, and I was a fan before there were fans.
Right.
Really, I mean, there were literally in Ossining Public High School, there were 3, 4, 5 other boys that were interested in it, and there were no girls.
Of course.
I mean,
it's not ladylike.
Oh, forget it. And then of course, by the time you got into the late 60s, it was you go with your girlfriend to the theater to watch a scary movie, and hoping to cop a feel, or get a kiss,
jump into your lap.
Yeah. But anyways, Stephen King really made it into mass art, I think, at least to me, in my generation. Yeah. I read everything he came out with, and and I thought he was absolutely brilliant all the way through the Richard Bachman books, and I did the last one, Thinner.
Was there anything that gave you like an emotional reaction though? Like, because everything you're talking about is being a fan of it as an auteur, but has there been anything that really gave you an emotional reaction?
Yes, Carrie did.
Yeah. What was the emotional?
That's heartbreaking.
Yeah.
I mean, that's heartbreaking. I mean, the closest I ever got to it was Psycho 2, which is you feel sorry for, you become emotionally involved and feel sorry for Norman Bates, the serial murderer, for God's sake.
Right. That's good writing right there, when you can actually empathize with a serial murderer.
But that's because I had experienced feeling bad for so many. I felt bad for the kid who was the outsider who got mocked and picked on.
Yeah.
And, in a few cases it was gay, but gay other kids who I didn't realize at the time, but were gay, and they didn't realize it either.
Yeah.
And then there were always the kid who was just, who picked his nose, or who couldn't stop eating,
Yeah, it's like we talked about earlier. In childhood, just bullying was almost like the status quo. So there were all those kids.
Not just bullying, but mocking.
Yeah.
And there were also class differences too.
Yeah.
Between kids who didn't have any money.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, there were people that people wearing their older brothers' hand-me-downs, for the third generation.
Yeah.
I mean, it was. It was. Now it's sort of socially prohibited. In some ways, I could argue it's made the kids softer, and so they're not as able to deal with life as they should as we were. Mm-hmm. Because we went through that. I mean, we really had fights. I'd come out of high school and there'd be a fight after high school was over. I remember going down behind the post office in Austin, New York, and having a fight with Kurt Swanson, and I wouldn't give up. And then he took my hand and he rubbed it on the rough blacktop until my knuckles bled before I said uncle and gave up.
Wow!
But he never bothered me again, and we became friends.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what high school was like when I went.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I think it's still a lot like that. I think what you're getting at in terms of, getting soft is that I do think that there are a lot of adults who are doing a better job of then stepping in and using what can be teachable moments to teach those kids who were being bullies, maybe not to be bullies. But the downside of that is that there are also bullies who are smart enough to listen to that and then just go, yeah, sure, okay. And then as soon as you turn your back, go back to what they were doing. I mean,
yes. Well, yeah. But I mean, if you're talking about the 50s and the 60s, it was still a very lawful society. I mean, we didn't have parental supervision. We stayed out and played until mom and you started to yell dinner time.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like you were saying about Halloween earlier. There was little to often no parental supervision, and it was a night of adventure because you would go out on your own because it was safe to do that at that time.
I remember going out and trick or treating by myself with a couple of other kids.
Yeah,
but people weren't. There was the horror that we're subjected to now is unthinkable.
Yeah.
The first mass killing I remember was the guy climbing up at UT in Austin into the watchtower, whatever it was, and shooting people with a rifle.
His last name was Whitman. We don't know yet if I'm related or not.
Wait, are we talking about UT or Kent?
Then Bogdanovich went out and made his first film on it and got his film career started.
Are we talking about UT or Kent?
But I mean, I don't remember what year that was, but that was the 60s.
Yeah.
And so you didn't have that break. You didn't have a complete breakdown in society that are things that are happening now were just on. You couldn't imagine them back in the 50s and the 60s.
I don't know. I think part of that's just a lot to do with press, or not press, but media and the speed of which that things get shared now. Because I don't think that it was the case that stuff didn't happen back then. I think you just didn't hear about it.
Yeah.
Okay,
it's quite possible.
I mean, go back to Mark Desaad. I mean, Mark Desaad was what, 1500s, 1600s. I mean, there are people doing some bad shit for a long time.
Okay, but I don't remember pedophilia.
Well,
back in those days. Now, I'm sure there was, but you're right. And as far as any kind of trans issues, I remember Christine Jorgensen, and that was like the one-off, and that was like the first guy from Scandinavia who had surgery trying to change his body. Mm-hmm. But I mean, but that was like horrifying. I mean, there was all these things that are now, so many of these things that are now common were just unacceptable. Mm. I mean, you could go on and on. People went to church in those days, you know, and now you're talking about Halloween being as big a holiday as Christmas.
Yeah.
People still go to church nowadays on Christmas and Easter, those 2 days.
Actually, me too.
Yeah,
I really enjoy midnight mass, and I go on Easter, and that's it.
Yeah.
But if you were from Highland, New York, the church was part of the social network that bound people together in smaller communities.
Yes.
Oh, it absolutely was. It wasn't even a question back then. It was Sunday night. You go to church.
Yeah.
Well, you have bake sales, and everybody would come down to do. They were community events.
Yes.
But you can watch that falling apart too.
Yeah.
If you travel at all through the Midwest and look at the farming, the 401 clubs and the Granges, and even all of that is falling apart. The Masons don't get together anymore.
Huh. That we know of.
Well, My grandfather had his 50, and he lived in 93. He had it, and I have it. He got his 50-year pin.
Wow.
From the Masons. And I have it. It was one of the things that was left to me. But I mean, if the Masons hadn't shown up, there would have been nobody to bury him.
Yeah.
Because nobody lived past 90 in those days.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, I mean, I know what you're saying, because I was raised by my grandmother, and she, I think, was of your generation. And, you know, my grandfather and my grandmother were both members of multiple social, I don't want to say parties, but like my grandfather was Polish, and he was part of the Polish National Alliance. He was part of the Polish Veterans of American Foreign Wars. He was the deacon of our church. He was also involved in another thing that I can't even think of off the top of my head. And
your grandmother was also a deacon, wasn't she?
No, she was the head lector of the church. And so, you know, as you're saying, that back then people were involved in multiple social organizations. Oh, Knights of Columbus. That was the other thing he was involved in.
Yes, of course. Knights of Columbus, the Lions Club.
Right. Mm-hmm. So, you know, that's something that definitely has changed, is these social organizations that people used to be a part of. I mean, they still exist. Like Shriners is around there.
Shriners was huge.
The Elks.
I think we still have Shriners here in Florida.
The Elk Club, right? The Elk Club.
I mean, they still exist. Yep. It's just not as the number of people who are joining them is dwindling, but they're still doing it. You got
another huge one now. You've got digital immigrants, which is like me, and then you got kids who are post-digital.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You know, and I mean, my God, that's such a huge separation. You know,
it really is.
I mean, I can't tell you, but you talk to a boomer, and you know, all of them are pre-digital, and then and now you talk to I have a granddaughter. She's 18 now, 17, and oh my gosh, what she can do digitally. You know, I mean, oh my gosh, you know.
Yeah. My I think 11-year-old now nephew told me the other day he's in coding class. He's in 5th grade, coding class.
I started out on a manual typewriter, and when I when I finally made enough money to get an IBM Selectrix, I thought I'd died and gone to heaven.
Yeah, same. I mean, like, you know, essays and things in grade school, but yeah, when I remember the transition from a manual typewriter to digital, like, oh my God,
yes,
it doesn't make noises. You don't have to keep putting the paper back.
Yeah, well, you don't have to use whiteout. You don't have to use whiteout anymore now that I walked around with the first computer. Was it called a Singer? I forget what. A first laptop computer, which weighed as much as a sewing machine.
Yep.
Yeah, and I thought having a little screen, black and white. I think a little green in it. But I mean, it changed writing, because you could revise without having to go and get whiteout to revise, or without having to get the blue paper to do a copy.
Yeah. For Chris's,
I mean, all these things have changed the arts.
For Chris's benefit, actually, I started coding in 5th grade in 1985. And IBM Selectrics do make noise. They hummed because I took typing classes on an IBM Selectric.
Fellas, this has been great. We've been talking for an hour and 25 minutes.
Yes.
And I'm going to have to go in here. So if you've got other questions or any specifics, now's the time, I think.
Sure.
Okay. We're near the end of the adulthood section. We can go ahead and do the wrap up.
Yes. So the topics that have been coming up multiple times in our conversation so far, I think really boil down to 2 or 3 things: adventure, being sensitive to other people, and there are some fears. For example, reaction to nuclear war was something big when you were a kid. It sounds like society falling apart is an important thing to you now as an adult. I say adventure because you mentioned things like, Lassie and Black Beauty and Treasure Island and Pirates and things like that, which is something that you were into in addition to horror.
I loved Howard Pyle, Pyle. That's all the pirate. That's the pirate books. Yeah.
Gotcha. So the question there being, well, actually, let me ask you a different question first. Do you see any common threads in what kinds of horror you like? Cannibalism, occult, metaphysical?
I like suspense, fellas.
Okay.
I mean, I would argue that in a lot of ways I write suspense. That's the basis for horror. I mean, look at Child's Play.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's a huge suspense piece.
Okay.
It is.
What movie?
The suspense, it's Hitchcockian. You see Brad Dourif put it, the opening scene, you see Brad Dourif put his soul in a serial murderer puts his soul into a doll.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And then you never see him again.
Right.
Nope.
But you know that doll is evil because you've seen the serial murderer who did it.
Yeah.
Put his soul in, you know who's in that doll.
Yeah.
But the people in the movie don't.
Right.
And that's the classical definition of suspense. The audience knows and the characters in the story don't.
Right.
Ah.
What movie would you say you've watched more times than any other?
Oh boy. I can give you a book, Dune.
Okay.
That works.
That's an interesting
movie or
one.
book.
Okay.
Yeah. That's a long book to have read multiple times.
I've got to have read that 10 or 12 times.
Ah, that's right. I forgot. You're a speed reader.
Yeah.
What do you love about Dune?
It's the story of a boy who in a way is chosen and can't avoid his fate.
Mm. Yeah.
And he has to either rise or fail to it. And at the same time, it's wrapped in environmentalism.
Yeah, you get the reluctant legacy, and it is wrapped in environmentalism and feudalism, which is a tale as old as time.
With religious overtones.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay.
You know, because you're really talking about the second coming in a way. I mean, it has so many themes in it.
You know about that aspect of it.
But he created them. I mean, he wrote that before they were there.
Yeah.
I mean, the prize doesn't go to the prize goes to huge success, yes, but it also goes to the innovator.
Yeah.
The one who started it. And I guess that's why I have such an admiration for Stephen King.
Yeah.
Yeah. But, you know, you have to have a historical perspective, which means you have to have lived through it. You have to have known what was there before it arrived to know how it changed things, which is Hitchcock and Psycho. But that you can also make the same argument with the writer in Rosemary's Baby. I mean, the writer, the director did a brilliant job, but kudos go to the writer of that. Kudos goes to the writer, the guy who wrote The Exorcist.
Yeah.
We all think it was a brilliant movie and the director did a brilliant job, but the guy who wrote that, the name's out of my head right now.
Yeah, no Friedkin directed.
Yes, that had.
I think I know the answer that you're probably going to give, but I want to ask it anyway because I don't want to put words in your mouth. But when we were talking about the things that you enjoy here, you know, adventure, being sensitive to others, this also even a little bit in Dune where you're talking about a story of a boy who can't avoid his fate and you have to rise or fall. Some of these topics could be explored in other genres. So do you have a sense of why it is, you know, why horror? What is it about horror that speaks to these things to you better than other genres?
Well, I sort of discovered it. They were the entry-level jobs in Hollywood. And I got the TV movie initiation of Sarah, which was one of the first body change movies where they couldn't do what I wanted to do, but they did the best they could. It's about witches in a sorority. And then I did The Beast Within, which is really a body change. A boy, it starts with a rape and ends with a rape. Try to do that today.
Wow.
But that is the sins of the parents visited on the children. That's what that story's about. And at the end, the progenitor is a monster. At the beginning, rather, and at the end, the son turns into a monster. But he passes his seed on. So you know it's going to go down through the generations. So the line in Hollywood is be careful of what you succeed at because you'll never be able to do anything else. But I didn't feel that way. I loved what I was doing, but I wouldn't I wouldn't say a lot of what I've done, a lot of what I've written is in your face horror. They've also had other themes and other. They've been concerned with things beyond just shocking or scaring the hell out of people.
That didn't go in the direction I thought it would, and so it sounded like you're saying that you kind of did horror as an entry level thing to get into Hollywood. However, we've been talking about you being a fan of horror ever since you were a kid. I kind of expected you were going to say that you got into Hollywood to tell these kinds of stories, but it sounds like you're saying that no, I wasn't even really so much concerned about telling horror stories. I just wanted to work in film regardless of what genre it was. Is that accurate?
Well, that is true. I was in love with film.
Okay.
I was in love with making movies, not television, making movies.
Okay.
Before it was even considered something that one could do or make a living at, and that was the push for so many. I was an actor for 10 years, but I was doing it when I was knocking on the door trying to get into directing.
Got it.
And I couldn't get in.
Okay.
And so there was a moment of time. I was in the actor studio, and I was in the playwrights unit of the actor studio, acting for writers who wanted to be directors. Some of them quite well known. Jim Bridges was one of them, and Paper Chase. And I saw what was happening, because that was the moment of Easy Rider in 1968, which really blew open the doors and made the entry possible for writers of originals. Try that now.
Yeah.
No way. God forbid that the studio should have to take a risk. But at that moment in time, the doors were open and I became a writer trying to get the directing. But I've been trying for 10, 15 years, 10, 12 years before that to get there. I wanted to make film.
Okay.
And my taste is suspense or scary,
right?
Yeah. I think it was brilliant, but I don't think I would have done done The Fly the way that Cronenberg did. I didn't come out. I wasn't thinking. I wasn't at 14 years old. I wasn't thinking about doing body horror.
Yeah. See, I thought you were going to say suspense. When I originally asked that question, I thought you were going to say that horror was just the best avenue because you can't really do suspense in any other genre. You can do a little bit of it, but if your entire movie is suspenseful, you can't do that in any other genre but horror, really.
Well, yes, but then think of Day of the Jackal.
Is that the one about the sniper?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Just one example. I can think of others if I go around, if I thought about it.
That would be suspense without horror.
Yeah, but suspense took me into horror, which is probably why I always loved it. But I started out as a mad science fiction fan too. But that was all there. That was all there was, both in movies and in books. When I got interested in this, then Hammer and AIP came in, and they were corny, for God's sakes.
Yeah. At times.
Some were.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it sounds like in your case, not to say that you're not a fan of horror, because clearly you are, but it was that you loved film in general even more, which...
Yes, I did.
Ken Foray said something pretty much the same.
He said the same thing, yeah.
Yeah,
it sounds like if I were to say the answer to what is it about horror that makes you happy is that it was an assistance into the role and life of storytelling. It helped you get that foot in the door.
But I'll tell you, you do a good horror movie that works for an audience, there's nothing more enjoyable than being at the previews and hearing them scream and laugh and, and be moved. You can do all kinds of things within the horror genre. It's about love, finally, fellas.
True.
It's really, it's what you love, but it's also what your characters love.
Yeah.
It's
a passion.
and includes the villains. Look at Jerry Dandridge, Chris Sarandon, and Fright Night.
Yep.
Fright Night, by the way, is my love letter to the genre.
Yep.
Yeah.
That's me as a fan back in 1958 or whatever it is, when they had Stagger Lee and Elvira and Dr. Lobo and Count DeVille. When they had those terrible, corny horror hosts. In the Friday Night Frights. Okay, guys, I love you very much. Have I given you enough?
You have. The only question we were going to ask is if there was anything else that you had thought of that you didn't get a chance to say. Maybe, the conversation took a left turn and you didn't get a chance to say something, but...
No, go look at terrortime.shop and buy my books. I'm writing novels. But I'm also writing books about my movies. Yes, and I did a table read last week that's going to be a huge podcast, a big horror movie called The Landlord, horror script called The Landlord. That's a whole other kind. Look at what's happening because of digital. It's all changing. Yeah. But I mean, it's streaming, and look how that's upsetting the business model.
Sure.
And I mean, they've killed movies. I could go on and on and on.
Well, we're going to put together a bio page for you, and we'll link to your website and all kinds of different stuff, and your fans can go check all of that out for you.
Please do.
First, let me say thank you for joining us. It's been a pleasure talking to you. And thank you to anybody out there listening. Please do come visit us at horrormakesushappy.com. We've got a list of people there that we've interviewed, people that we'd like to get in touch with. If you can help us out with any of those people, let us know. You can support us by becoming a Patreon supporter, buying us coffee. You can join us on Twitch or Discord. And if you can't do any of those things, just tell a friend.